Well, welcome to Medical Center Hour. I'm Danny Becker, and this is a named lecture, and I want to tell you something about Dr. Ellis Moore, who graduated from the UVA School of Medicine in 1927 after teaching a few years in rural Mississippi. A few years after graduating and doing his ENT training at New York Hospital, he married Catherine Finney, who happened to be somebody whose tonsils he had removed a few years before that. They had 2 sons, and this lecture was endowed by the sons, and I want to acknowledge Ellis Moore Jr. from Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Preston Moore from Newark, Connecticut. This is the 2nd year we've had a Moore lectureship, and the plan is to coordinate this talk with the Virginia Festival of the Book. And in fact, at 6 o'clock today, our speaker and Bruce Hillman, Dr. Bruce Hillman, Dr. Hostler, and me will be doing a presentation at the downtown library as part of the Virginia Festival of the Book. So it's a great honor and pleasure to reintroduce Lynn Eckert, who was here last year for the Women in Medicine program. She's visiting us from Boston, where she directs academic programs for the Partners Harvard Medical International Collaboration. And this involves helping medical schools begin and thrive in places like Lebanon and South Africa. But that's not what she's going to talk about today. She's had an accomplished career in pediatrics, academic medicine, organized medicine, eventually as the leader in any organization she joins. But lately she's been a playwright, and I think she's going to help us understand how writing complements all these other roles: doctor, teacher, leader. Lynn, welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be back. And when you're from Boston, it's especially nice to be invited in the spring, when you know, at the end of March, when you still have 2 feet of snow in your driveway. You're thinking spring will never come, and then you get to come to Virginia and you realize it will come. So there's hope in our future. So it's delightful to be here. I wanted to sort of start with you and talk about a colleague of mine, Dr. Connie Bowe. When she works with residents and young physicians, she asks them a question, which is, when was the first time you thought of yourself as a doctor? Can you think back and reflect? Was it the time that you downed the white coat? First it was the short one, and then it was, or did you have to wait until it was the long one? Was it a time when maybe you sutured your first patient and it looked pretty good? Or maybe it was the time when a patient actually called you a physician. But my guess is, if you go back and think about it, it didn't just occur overnight. It was something that took a long time, that it was a gradual before you actually thought of yourself as a physician. Well, it's sort of the same thing with being a writer. The first time that anybody referred to me as a playwright, I sort of looked around and thought, who is that? And then I didn't know which way you spelled it. Do you spell it W-R-I-G-H-T or W-R-I-T-E? Sort of, one is the craft and one is the process of writing. And then before a performance, even though I'm not the actor, people said that I should break a leg. And surely I didn't think they wanted me to fracture my femur. But what did that mean? And so I went and sort of looked up the meaning of what it means to break. What does break a leg mean? Do you have any idea what that means? Knock yourself out. But it's interesting. There are lots of different thoughts about what it means. But there are a couple of them that I sort of like. One goes back to as far as Shakespeare. And apparently the poorest people stood in the front of the Globe Theater. And they used to sort of, apparently they were busy drooling at the time that they were up in front. So breaking a leg meant when you bow over, you have to bend your leg. And it was, hopefully you could, with all this drool, because they liked it so well that you would slip. So they didn't want you to break your leg, but they wanted you to have the opportunity that people liked it that well. So this drooling audience. So I'm not expecting that. The second one was that people gave tips. And so when you bowed down to get your tip, you had to break your leg to be able to reach the money. And the third one is about the curtain. And that the breaks in the curtain had to be opened. You had to go through the break in the curtain more often if you came out for more bows. So breaking a leg meant that the audience liked what you were doing. So it's kind of fun to sort of think about where some of these terms come. Now I only have a couple of slides, so we can show them. Now you probably wonder, where did I get this title, Getting It Right, Right, or Right? Because what I wanted to do was obviously talk to you about how I went about writing this play about Elizabeth Blackwell that was performed here last year, or read dramatically here last year, called The Lady Alone. The next slide, please. And just have 2 slides. So these are the working definitions. The first right is the true or correct as a fact. So I'm doing this as a medical historian, I'm not a medical historian, but using it as a medical history to get the facts about Elizabeth. So I want to get those facts correct. The same thing if you're writing about your patients or you're writing about a diagnosis. You want to get those facts correct. The second right is about composing the text and putting it in a literary form. The context and how the words you use and your spelling and your punctuation and all those kinds of things. And the third right is the right of a maker or builder. And that in the case of my case, since I'm not writing novels or something, is crafting a play, is actually crafting a play and then crafting the performance, which was a real learning experience for me. So that's the end of the slides. Thank you. Certainly, I think writing is an adventure, and like most adventures, we usually begin with something personal. And it might be a patient, a relationship with one particular patient, or a group of patients like Chekhov wrote a lot of short stories besides the plays he wrote. And one of the short stories he wrote was called Peasants, and it really came from the fact that he took care of a lot of very poor patients. He thought of himself actually as a physician first and then a playwright. He became much more of a famous playwright after he died. But so he took care of his patients first, and so he wrote about his patients. Or it may be about an encounter we've had with the healthcare system, like Richard Kleitzman wrote, When Doctors Become Patients, and we've read stories about our own experiences, or our experiences as trainees, and one of the most popular ones, of course, which has been sort of resurfacing again in the last couple of years, is Samuel Shem's book, A House of God, that many of us read in our early training. In my case, my interest actually began personally because I had a child. My older son, my eldest child, went to Hobart William Smith Colleges, and that's the school where Elizabeth Blackwell went to medical school. At that time it was called Geneva Medical School, and it was in Upstate New York and Geneva, New York. When we started out on, any of you who've done this in the recent past, you start out on a tour, and when we started out on a tour, we were in the Elizabeth Blackwell Library, and immediately I was interested. Decided I was going to go to that school. My son turned out going to go to that school, and so that started me that his heritage and my heritage as a woman physician were the same, and so it was a nice thing to think, okay, what's your next step? So to go to the RIGHT, Getting It Right, what I did is I started out and I looked at the Hobart William Smith Library and what collection they had on Elizabeth Blackwell. And then I went to the Geneva Historical Society and looked at the collection they had. And then I went bigger. And I went to the Library of Congress. And in the Library of Congress, there were all sorts of papers, but they had all been microfilmed. on Elizabeth Blackwell. And it turns out, for your interest, if you want to work with something from the Library of Congress, yes, you can go to Washington and work in the rare books area, which is fun to do. But you can also have them sent to any library that is willing to accept them. So I had them sent to a place called Old Sturbridge Village. And for those of you in Virginia, that is sort of a mini rural Williamsburg. And I happened to have a cottage in Sturbridge, so I worked in that. It was easy for me to get to and use, and I worked in the library. And across the table from me in the library were people dressed up in 1840s costume, which was the time Elizabeth was going to medical school. So I got into the feeling of what she was about and what she was up against, and sort of the kind of facilities and stuff that would be available, because she was also in a small town. From that, I was also able to get papers from, let me back up a step. I met John Blackwell, who was Elizabeth Blackwell's grandnephew. He never knew her because he was born the year she died. But he said to me, Lynn, what you need to do is you need to go to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, because the Harvard University group there has the papers that the family gave. And so there were papers from not only Elizabeth, but her sisters, brothers, and it was quite an interesting family of 9 children. And so I went there, and there I was able to actually handle her letters, which to me was really pretty fantastic, to be able to use the primary sources and see how she wrote, what she received, how she responded, and those kinds of things. So that was really good. But in also getting it correct, I want to back up a second and tell you about another writer who you may know, which is Richard Seltzer, who was a surgeon from Yale, who gave up surgery to become a writer. And when he did that, when I met him, he actually stayed at our home one time, and he said to me, I'll be getting up between 2 and 4 in the morning, and I write from 2 to 4, so if you hear me up, don't worry. So he was up, and then he goes back to bed. But he said when he started out writing, he spent a year in the Yale Library reading, getting the etymology of the language, the English language. So he spent reading the dictionary, figuring out what the words were. He sort of approached writing to get it right as the way he had approached surgery, being very precise so that his language was like a well-placed suture, which I thought was pretty fascinating. So to get it right, you have to get, if you're doing something historical, you want to get the right background, and if you're doing something that is related to your patients, you want to get that right, and you want to get the language right. Rita Sharon, who runs the program at Columbia, she has people doing this parallel writing of the patient chart writing that we all do as physicians. And then a parallel chart, which is talking about the narrative of medicine, is talking about how we feel about what's going on, the tensions we feel, and sort of where we're going from there. Well, to go back to Elizabeth, in gathering this data, there was no definitive biography that had been written. Julia Boyd's biography actually came, which is called The Excellent Dr. Blackwell, actually came out a couple of years after I was doing the work on the play. So I had to go to the primary sources, which I liked. And the biographies that had been written about Elizabeth were written for 5th grade girls. They were those short little books that many of you saw and many of us read, and they helped us to decide that what we wanted to do was grow up and be a doctor. But there wasn't anything that really told a lot of the stories of Elizabeth. So I had to really go to the primary sources. Subsequently, I realized that I also wasn't just interested in Elizabeth. I had to know something about the time period. So I had to know something about between 1821, when she was born, and 1910. So I went back and looked at what was happening in medicine and sort of what were the other influences on Elizabeth. And some of those influences were people that are well-known names to you, because some of her acquaintances were Florence Nightingale when she was in England, and Harriet Beecher Stowe when she was in America. And so and then the abolitionists were a big part of of who she was in the Civil War occurred. So I needed to sort of get a sense of how that happened. One of the other influences was her grandmother. And what I wanted to do today was I wanted to show you some clips of the play. And then I realized I couldn't show you the clips of the play because the clips I have are from Actors Equity actor. And so although I have them for my personal use, I can't show them to you. So you are going to have to hear me being Elizabeth. Okay? So now the play that I've written is a one-woman show. And so Elizabeth Blackwell, which was modeled after the Belle of Amherst. How many of you ever saw the Belle of Amherst? Do you know that play? Okay. So I saw it in 1976, when Julie Harris did it for the first time, and she was marvelous. And then I saw it again in 2001 when Julie Harris did it again in Boston. So I was in this. This is fantastic. And it was about the same time that my son was going to college, and I was thinking of doing this, and I was just sort of starting to gather data. So that was my model. So here we have Elizabeth is now playing the role as if she's her grandmother. Okay, so here we go. And I'm not an actor or an actor equity for sure. You'll know that in a minute. Come along, girls. Gather round and sit down. Let's have a bit of tea. Anna, you may sit next to me and pour. Marianne, please pass the cups. Emily, there's plenty of room for you just next to Elizabeth. Ellen, I've saved a chair, a small chair just for you. What a pleasure to have all 5 of you together. Now, young ladies, I want to give you some important advice. Listen carefully. I expect each of you to be suspicious of male flattery. When a young man takes your hand and says to you, "My dear, you are so beautiful. You are such a gracious lady. I am so charmed." Beware. Let me warn you. After a man marries a woman, all that sweet talk ceases. And what happens to the poor girl, only just a bride? Soon enough, she realizes what a dreadful master is marriage. Only then it is too late. That is how Elizabeth, one of the reasons Elizabeth made up her mind that she was not going to marry. And she used a term called an insuperable barrier to marriage. So when I'm writing this play, I talk about the insuperable barrier to marriage because I want to use her exact words because I think it becomes much more authentic. So the words that I just gave are words that she talks about, that she puts in her autobiography about what happened with her grandmother and how she made that decision. Okay. Besides looking at her letters that she wrote, and she wrote a short autobiography, which she wrote for her daughter. She doesn't really have a daughter, but she had a daughter she sort of adopted, and I can get into that later. But I also went to the medical literature of the time, and I did that both in England and in the United States. And the Boston Medical Journal, which is the precursor of the New England Journal, wrote letters about how bad this was, that this woman should go to medical school, and it was basically a nefarious practice that shouldn't be repeated. So I went to look and see those kinds of things, and that was great fun to do. I also went and I looked at the lay press to see what the lay press was saying about Elizabeth and what did this mean to have a woman go to medical school. And that's where I got the title of the play, A Lady Alone, because there is a line in her hometown of Geneva, New York, that said it was like a scene for a painter, a lady alone. So that's where I got the title for what we were doing. Okay. As we went along, I wanted to see if I could read just a second here, a piece. Okay, I'm going to read to you another part, a small clip, to show you to the time frame in which she was working. Okay, so she's already a doctor. She's graduated from medical school. She went to Europe, and in Europe she had wanted to be a surgeon. So she went to Europe, and while she was taking care of patients in the ward in the newborn unit, a child had gonorrhea, and she had to take care of that child in the middle of the night. And while she's taking care of that child, she splashes her eye with the pus of the baby, and she gets gonorrhea in her eye, and she becomes blind in that eye, and eventually she actually has to have that eye removed. Now this is somebody who wanted to be a surgeon. So she going to be able to be a surgeon as a one-eyed surgeon. She decides that this is not going to be a possibility, so she ends up sort of doing more maternal and child health kinds of things and public health kinds of things. But she ends up in New York. She went to Europe because at that time everybody, or most people, went to Europe to train, to do their additional training after medical school. They either trained in England or France. So she did. She started out in Paris and ended up in this hospital. And then she came back to the United States, and she's working in the United States at the New York Infirmary, which she started, which still exists, okay, down on the Lower East Side of New York. And she started a medical school. And she's doing this in the 1850s and 1858. She opens her medical school. Then the Civil War came. So I'm going to go take you to a little scene in the play in which she's talking now again. On April 12th, 1861, life changed for all America. The first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. We were abolitionists, just like Papa before us. As Union troops gathered and headed to battle, Emily, my sister, came to me. Of course we can help. Dorothea Dix certainly will need more women for our Army Nursing Corps, but she does have some strange requirements, you know. No women under 30 and no beauties either. She must like plain women, thinking they will not distract the young soldiers. So we selected the most hardy of women. We trained them in the basics: wound care, bandaging, cleanliness, hygiene, feeding, and disposing of the dead. We were confident in their abilities. As they reached the front, we began to hear their stories. Hospitals were overcrowded and filthy. The stench of death permeated the sick rooms. Boys succumbed to contagious diseases. And then, thankfully, the war ended. Now, I'm not Elizabeth anymore, so going back, I had to go back and read more about the Civil War. Even though I don't have a very long amount of words in there, you have to get a real sense of what was happening and what she was doing. She was in the Sanitation Commission, and she was trying to train the nurses. So I had to get a real feeling of what that was. Okay, so that's the first part about getting it right with the R-I-G-H-T. The next part is about writing it down. Sitting down and writing and rewriting and cutting and writing once again. And then as I write, I had to read again to get more background, which I think was important, because writing itself is a solitary activity, but it's the editing that really helps. Oftentimes when we pick up a book and we see that there are compliments to the editor from the author, and we also hear the bad stories where they say, well, the editor was so terrible that the book doesn't sound at all like I wanted it to, or has taken it away. But in the best cases, they really help us to be more concise, to be clear, to demonstrate the evidence, and those kinds of things. So what do you do when you're writing? And I know what you've done. Many of you are in a peer group of folks that you write with and then you read to, and they can hopefully constructively criticize your work, which is exactly what I did. They asked the pesky questions like, what is it you're really trying to say here? Or, how are you feeling about this experience? What is it in your feeling that you're trying to get across? So I found it helpful to join a writing group, and I also, the other thing I did was read a lot of plays. Some of the things that I found helpful, some of the books about writing that I found helpful, one of them I liked a whole lot was by Anne Lamott, who wrote Bird by Bird. And Bird by Bird is a reference to the fact that her brother was doing a project for school, and he was overwhelmed. He waited till the night before, and the father was a writer. And the father said, well, it was about ornithology, so he had to write about all these birds. And so he said, well, you just do it bird by bird, one bird at a time. So it's page by page, or sentence by sentence, or word by word. And so I think that was helpful. The old War Horse, Elements of Style by Strunk and White, prevented some of my errors. And I probably missed a few. And of course, my mother's voice, as she was a former Latin teacher, was always in my mind as to correct grammar and syntax. So the writing, having the group listening was good. Getting it right, the W-R-I-G-H-T, the craft, the maker, the building of a playwright is something that I think is a little bit different. There are real tensions between training in medicine or training in science and in playwriting. The tensions that I find were, we've been taught to be very precise in our history taking. We often write as the chief complaint exactly what the patient told us in the patient's words, because that helps us. And it helps us when we tell the story to somebody else on rounds, whatever. We like that precision. But as a playwright, using the historical language, I wanted to be precise, but the play turned out to be about 2 hours. Now, when you have a 2-hour play and you have one actor, forget it. They're good. They can't do it. You need to have something that's under an hour. It's also something the audience liked. So I had to figure out how to get that down. So I had to use sort of the artistic license, think of poetic license. So this is artistic license as a playwright. And this was the most difficult thing for me, to go from this big body of what I knew to something that would hold an audience. And my purpose was, why did I do this in the first place? Most people didn't know who Elizabeth Blackwell was. And I thought she deserved a place on the stage. And if I had to do it, I would do it. So I did it. But that was very hard, condensing it. And, you're not always exactly like she would have done it. You try your best, but you still have to manage this. And then the whole creation of it is one thing. Edward Albee talks about the travail of creation and the jungle of production. So when you're writing a play, you've written this play, and then you start getting either dramatic actors to read it and to work with you. And this is where the real fun begins. Because an actor will say to you, well, these are wonderful lines, but I can't say them in the amount of time that I think they should have, or I can't get across the stage, or I can't do this, or this doesn't make sense, or you need more alliteration here, or whatever. So there's all this crafting of it. And I worked with 2 actors. One was here last year, and then another one who's memorizing it, who does it around the country right now. And she sat across the kitchen table from me, and we'd go over line by line of the play, and then she'd jump up in my kitchen and she'd act it out. And I'd say, oh, that's horrible. Can't you do it this way? And then she'd sometimes say, well, I could if you just changed 3 words or 1 word. It was quite fascinating, the difference and how it took. So that whole speech was really important. So, so you have the playwright and the actors working together, and this is called workshopping when you're doing this. And then you have a triangle. You have the audience, the playwright, and the actors working together. And in that triangle, you realize the communication has to be between the playwright and the actor, between the actor and another actor on the stage, if you have more than one actor, which I didn't, and then between the actors and the audience. And how does all that work together? Now, one of the things I did is after I had written this play, I was surprised that it was as successful as it was, that people actually liked it. It was going from medical school to medical school and historical society and libraries. They said, well, maybe you ought to do what you did for medicine, which was you went to school and found out how to write a play. So I went to Sarah Lawrence, which is an intensive playwriting, has an intensive playwriting course, also an intensive writer's course, And it's wonderful. And I suggest you take your week's vacation and you go up to New York in June and you take something like this, because it's a real booster for those of you who would like to write. We took courses in the morning, we wrote plays in the afternoon, and we saw plays that we had written, sections of our plays that we had written, performed by a troupe of actors in the evening. That they were reading what we wrote, and it was just such a high. I would call my husband at 12 and 1 in the morning when I would finish, and he said that I was just so excited. It was just a wonderful experience. During that process, I was working on something else, but I showed them A Lady Alone, and the actor who came here and the director who came here last year to present were both faculty members at Sarah Lawrence. They just happened to like the work. They liked Elizabeth. And they have now taken it to a new level. And the level they've taken it to, they asked me if they could write a grant to the Sloan Foundation, which they did. And they are trying to get that play workshopped, as they call it, in New York at a theater in New York. Now, I talked to them last week to find out if they had heard or not. They hadn't heard yet, but just the fact that they found it of value was very, very nice for me. But we'll see what happens with it. The second thing that happened was when it was done at Harvard, a woman who I had met at a party, and somebody said that I had this play that was going to be done at Harvard. She just happened to show up, and she was she's an executive director for WGBH in the public radio station in Boston, and she has done a number of films. One of them was on RX for Survival, which many of you may have seen, which is about health in the developing world. So she was particularly interested in health, and that was nominated for an Emmy. So anyway, she saw it, and she asked me to bring it to WGBH, which we did about a year ago. And we took it there with the director and the actor who had been in Virginia. And they did a shortened version, read it, and now this woman is in the process of writing a bigger grant to the National Endowment for the Arts to have this play made into as a centerpiece for a film, much more, which would be more elaborate than what I've written, but about the life of Elizabeth Blackwell and maybe about women physicians in general. So we're in the process of trying to get funding for that. So some of the funds came either from my family or my friends or from some of the performances that were done. So just to get the grant written. So some of the things that you don't think are going to happen, happened. You know, I was just very fortunate. So that it's been a great adventure. I think I want to just talk a little bit more about the interaction, because I think that's what you're doing here. The interaction between writers or between an audience and a playwright, or that it's that critique that is so helpful. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if you have any experiences here. When you write, do you read to each other?
Yes.
Yes. And what happens when you do that?
Well, you often discover that what you think you're saying isn't what people are hearing.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And then what do you do?
I mean, even if you've looked at it 100 times, well, then you take that back and you get up at 2 o'clock in the morning and revise.
Yeah. So in my case, I started out with a writing group just to get the writing sort of right. And it was very nice to have an audience that was not a medical audience, because nobody in my writing group was in medicine. Yours is different, but nobody was in medicine, because I was trying to get this out sort of not just for the medical community, but for the public, I guess. Because I sort of felt Elizabeth Blackwell had got the short end of the stick. People don't really know about her. And so these people, they didn't, the things that we take for granted, because we're all in medicine, about what's happening in the hospital or whatever, they wanted more explanation. They wanted me to be more precise. So it was difficult to do, but it was the right thing to do. So, I can't say enough about having, you start out with your friends and then, you start out with your family and pretty soon, you know, they glass over. My husband thought he was living with Lynn and Elizabeth, you know, for many days. I think he preferred Lynn, but maybe not sometimes. And then, you know, then their family and then friends. And what happened is there were a number of friends who just liked this piece, who just set up places where it could be read in a larger audience where people would critique what they saw and what they heard. And of course, some of this critique has been very, very helpful, and it made me change parts of the play. And other things, you just look at them and you nod and shake your head and smile and say, no, I'm not changing that. For example, originally the people from Sarah Lawrence suggested that I have more than one character, because I have a lot of voices. She plays about 35 voices in there. She plays men, she plays other women, she plays older people, she plays younger people. She said, just have a few more. And I said, but the whole thing is, the title is A Lady Alone, which came from the press. I didn't make this up. It came from reality, number one. Two, she was the only one at the time. And so I think if she's on stage by herself, it emphasizes the fact that she was a loner. So I stuck with that. The other thing I think that I wanted to do it as a one-person show is we have to go back and ask ourselves, why do we do this in the first place? Yes, my son went to that college. Yes, I was a woman physician. But what connection did I actually have with Elizabeth Blackwell? And I think it was the fact that at the University of Massachusetts, I was the only woman chair for 15 years. And that's a long time. And it's lonely in many cases. And I knew that I had the advantage of having a lot of women come before me in medicine, but not come before me in leadership and academic medicine, certainly in my school. And so I know that that resonated with me. So I'm sure there are certain things about the patients you're writing about or the experiences you're writing about that really are very personal, that resonate with you. Now, I didn't think about that in the beginning, but so many people asked me that I realized when I was thinking about why did I do that is probably why I did it. That was a little bit maybe of my story that I was trying to share with people. Okay. To me, the lessons of learn are just to sort of summarize, because I'd like to sort of have you have a chance to talk, are first you have to get the facts right. Get it right in terms of, I didn't want to be saying things about Elizabeth that didn't happen. And the only way I would know that was to go to the primary sources. So as you write about your patients, you go back to the chart. You go back to your notes. Some of us who have gray hair here and were physicians before the HIPAA rules, I bet if we go home, because I have them, I bet a lot of you have 3x5 cards of some of those patients you took care of when you were an intern or a resident that were so special to you. We used to stamp their names on the top of the card and then we put little notes down. I have those in a desk drawer. HIPAA wouldn't like that now, but because it has their names on it. But I have that, and so those can become rich things for you to write about. But you want to get the facts right. And I wanted to get the time frame right. The second one is getting the writing right, because you were educated to write correct. My mom being a Latin teacher, you have to get that right. So I had to go back to some of the old textbooks about how you write and do those kinds of things. And Elizabeth was also well-spoken. And then lastly, and this is more about crafting the output you're going to do. Because maybe you're just writing for yourself. Maybe you're writing because you want it published. But in my case, I wanted it to have it produced because I wanted to share it. Most of us are writing because we want to share it with somebody. So in a play, what is going to make it interesting to people? So that whole crafting requires the triangle of the writer, the actor, and the audience. And I was fortunate that I came across people who were really very willing to help me. And it took a whole community. It's sort of like, it takes a community to raise a child. Well, it takes a community to write a play. It takes your family and friends, and it takes people who are just willing to read and hear your work and offer critique, comments that are constructive. And they became extraordinarily supportive and suggested places that it could be first produced. But all along the way, they assured me that what I was doing was of importance to others, that others would really care about this. And to believe that something you're doing is going to be of value is a real motivator. And to me, it goes back to where we all started when we chose medicine. We knew we were doing something of value. And so writing in medicine is also of value. So, thank you.
I'd like to take any questions. Just one comment that when Lynn invited you to the Bronx for a Sarah Lawrence writing experience, there's also a writing retreat for health professionals in Taos, New Mexico in August that I'm part of. So choose between the Bronx or Taos.
Wait a minute, it's Bronxville.
Bronxville, excuse me. Questions?
Either one will do.
Yeah.
Thank you. As an academic physician, I'm wondering why you chose to craft your work as a play instead of publishing it as a biography or as a peer-reviewed publication. And also, what you could tell us about the most exciting thing you learned about her that the rest of society didn't know.
Okay, thank you. Great questions. Both of them are great questions. A lot of people asked me if I was going to write a book. And I couldn't think that a lot of people were going to read this book. And it would take the effort that would go into writing it. It just didn't fit what I wanted to do. I wanted her story told. I could have written it as an essay, yes, for a peer-reviewed journal. And I suppose I still could do that. But to me, it was more important that her story was told. And more people have seen this play now. I think the actress, we were in, I don't go with it all the time, but the actress that does it, the one that is memorizing it does it, she was asked that question last week when we were in Nebraska. And she said she's done it 70 times. So I realized I have reached more people that way, which was my purpose. So it wasn't, wasn't purely academic. I think if it was purely academic, then I would have had to do the book. But what are the things I learned about her? Oh, these are great questions. This is what I really love. This was the fun part, and this was what fell on the floor when I had to cut it from 2 hours into an hour. She was a really feisty lady. And somebody said to me, did you fall in love with her? I said, oh no. Sometimes I really liked her, and other times I didn't like her at all. But, she didn't get where she got because she was warm and fuzzy either. And so some of the stories that let me share. One of them was Elizabeth was always a little bit short of money. And one of the ways she got money was to get it from her brothers. She was one of 9 children, 5 girls, 4 boys. And so she would get her brothers to send her money, even when she was running this infirmary and stuff in New York and starting the medical school. So I was a little short of money. So we're talking about the 1850s now. So her one brother is working for the railroad that's being built across, Transcontinental Railroad, across the United States. So I found a letter at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard that said, Dear Harry, you're working on something like, Dear Harry, you're working on the railroad, and I know you know where the railroad's going to go across the United States, but they haven't announced that, what towns it's going through. So why don't you just tell me where those places are? I know it's not public. You just tell me, and I can buy up property along that. So I think that's a pretty good inside trader person, that she knew what she really wanted. So that's one thing I learned, that wasn't shared. The other thing is, when she's working in New York, she has she had decided she would never marry, as did none of her sisters did either. And so, but she wants a child. So she goes to an orphanage on Randall's Island in New York, because there were a lot of orphanages then. And she picks up a little Irish girl named Kitty Berry, who's about 7. And she brings her home, and she lives with her her entire life. Kitty never married. She lived with her in New York, and then eventually Elizabeth went back to England and spent the last 30 years in England. She was born in England, came here when she was about 12, and went back to study, then was here in the United States for a long time, and then went back for the last 30 years of her life, dying at about 89. Anyway, so Kitty was with her her whole life. Kitty was named Kitty Berry. I found a letter in the archives in Schlesinger that said, "I never thought I had the right to give Kitty the Blackwell name. That was reserved for her brother's legitimate children, not Kitty Berry." Kitty Berry eventually takes the name of Blackwell. I'm not sure. I think it's after Elizabeth dies, but I couldn't find that exact fact out. If somebody knows, share that with me, please. But just that fact. And that little girl, when she was a little girl, never called her mom, always called her my doctor. So the last line in the play, let me read it to you. I can get it to you easily, but I messed these up. Just a second here. I may have to just paraphrase it.
While Lynn's doing that, I should add that the question came from Ivan Logan, Department of Neurology, since the medical center hours now appear on YouTube, so Ivan, you'll be mentioned on YouTube.
I will have to do it from heart because apparently I didn't print the last page. But Elizabeth, at the end of the play, she's talking about how she was the first woman to become a physician, but she didn't do this alone, that men and women helped her go forward, and other people were doing it in their own fields, in writing and other fields. She wasn't around when the boat came. But anyway, so at the end, she tells a story when Kitty was a little girl, a very little girl. They had a very prominent physician come over to the house for dinner, who was a male. And they had a very nice evening. And when he left, Kitty turned to her and said, how very odd it is to see a male physician. So I ended the play that way. Yes. It was
Robert Epstein has a question.
I'm going to ask a very whimsical question, but it's to make a point. The question is, do you think we should print out all our emails and file them in Radcliffe? And if not, what will be the material for playwrights of the 22nd century?
That is such a wonderful question. I sit on the archives for Women in Medicine committee at the Countway Library at Harvard. And we had that discussion. We said, how many of us write anything? We put it all in emails and then we delete them. And there was a woman at the table who had been one of the deans at Harvard, and she said, I saved every single email. I haven't deleted anything. I've got these huge archives. But I think that will be a real issue. And people are very concerned about that at the archives, that there will not be the kinds of information we need. So they're actually, what the committee is trying to do, one of the things the committee is trying to do is encourage people to keep certain kinds of documents and suggesting to people who are sort of nearing retirement, who haven't thrown out maybe a lot of things yet, to meet with an archivist and talk about what you should keep and what you shouldn't keep. But your question isn't just whimsical, it's right on. Thank you.
shall.
All right. I'm Rolf Morris. I am a chaplain resident in clinical pastoral education. Well, first a comment about the emails. My assumption is they are all archived at the National Security Agency. But my question for you comes out of our experience of writing for one another. Part of our program is based on reflecting on practice. We bring case studies which we write up, and for years we've called them our dramas. We do verbatim transcripts of conversations, not from tape, but from what we remember of the conversations. So they really are dramas, and their purpose is partly to tell us about the patient, but mostly so that we should understand ourselves. So, having written this play, what truth have you told yourself?
Good question.
I may have told myself that I'm as prickly, or was as prickly, as Elizabeth Blackwell was. I mean, she was. She didn't get where she got without pushing, and I'm sure I didn't get where I got without being a bit prickly. I don't like to think of it that way, but I bet there's some truth in that.
Yeah, go ahead, Anita.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for that lecture. It was really helpful. I'm sort of a burgeoning physician, so I appreciate that you sort of pointed out the steps of how you sort of got to the writing part of it. My question was also sort of a logistical question on the steps. How did you physically and literally find the time and the energy to balance sort of your physician life and your writing life? Because that's something I'm really interested in personally.
And just for the sake of our internet audience, this is Anita Patel, soon to be a fourth-year medical student at UVA.
Thank you. I'm blessed with a tremendous amount of energy, I have to tell you that. My family doesn't think I need very much sleep. When I left UMass, although I'm still a professor at UMass because I teach in their public health program, and went to Harvard, I gave myself a mini sabbatical, which is something you can do when you get a little older. And my children by then were gone. I have 3 children, and they were either working or in school. So that made it a little bit easier. But it's like anything else. If you really want to do something, somehow you create that time. You take it from, I don't know what, you take it from somewhere else, but you just did it. I mean, if you find it so exciting, I found it so exciting to work with the primary sources that I just figured out how to do it. And it was great fun.
Sharon Hostler.
Lynn, I'm thinking about you constructing, the last part of constructing the play.
Yes.
But I'm wondering how that process has changed the way you, number one, read a play and your attendance and seeing a play. I mean, whether that has, how those 3 different aspects of being with a play has interfaces and influences.
In the first place, I see many more plays than I used to. And I read plays, but I used to read plays before. I don't know why. I just read them. I mean, the last play I was ever in was in grade 6. And I'll tell you the story of that, which wasn't so good. I was the lead. It was a play about a little girl from Norway. And when I was in 6th grade, I didn't have white hair. I had blonde hair. And so I had to play this lead. And they told me, and the day before the play was going on, and I had an understudy, the day before the play was going on, that I had to hold hands with this little boy. And that was a no-go for me. I said, I'm not doing it. And the teacher said, well, then you can't be in the play. And I said, okay. So I wasn't. So that was my last experience. Stubborn little girl. But my friend got to play. She had dark hair and didn't look like a Swede, but that worked for her. But one of the things I like to do is go to plays now that have after the play, they have a talk back, which I had never done before, because I like to see how they don't always do them with the playwright, though. They often do them with the directors. How the director and the actors and stuff, the people respond to what the audience is asking about. So that's something really different. And then I do think about the craft. I do watch how they get somebody from A to B on the stage, or why they bring something in at a certain time, and how precise is the language, which I look at it, and all of those factors that I probably didn't pay very much attention to, because I noticed that that's what I had to do as I rewrote, and as people helped me critique it. They were, each word is very important when you don't have very many words that you can write, because they've got to be done in 50 minutes. That's how I looked at it. So it was a real learning experience for me.
Marcia Childress, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Thanks so much, Lynn. This was wonderful. I'm curious, two things very quickly. What do you intend to have become of this play as time goes on? And then I'm just curious what your colleagues in your immediate work environment, I mean, you've come to us as a writer, but you go to work in other settings, not primarily as a writer, and I'm just curious how this aspect of your work has been received by your colleagues.
The first one was, I forgot the first question.
Oh, what's going to become of it?
Oh, what's going to become of it? What's going to become of it if we're lucky? And if people want to donate money to this, to get this, people to write the grant, the editor, executive director from Boston to do this, it'll become a film. And we have a wonderful advisory group, which includes the woman who wrote the definitive biography from England about the play, and Julia Boyd did a very nice book, the excellent Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, and other people, historians, that would be on that. So that would get the story wider, which I would really like. The second thing is, what does it mean to sort of the people I work with? It's been pretty fascinating. The play's been presented for a couple of years now, and in January, they asked me, we have what we call brown bag lunches, where we talk about international health kinds of things, and they asked me to present this work. And it turned out that one of the women that I work with, a young woman, she works in the office as an administration, but she's really an actress. That's what she likes to do, but you have to make your living. So instead of getting the usual people to read it in this brown bag lunch, I had her do it, so that we were able to showcase what she did as an actor and what I did as a writer. And the people liked that. They liked to see that there was an expansion of talent. And we also brought in the woman from that had done the RX for Survival, which was about on global health, and they could see some of the lessons that you could make public. That don't have to be a story about Elizabeth Blackwell, but something else could be made public. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'd invite you to return next Wednesday. Is it Michael Stein, who's a general internist from Brown, will be talking about The Lonely Patient. He's another physician writer, very accomplished. Please come back. Thank you. Thank you.